This is CTV's W5. Here is Tom Clark.
Good evening and welcome to W5. Well, if there's been one good thing to come of the sponsorship scandal, it's this. Canada may soon have its first whistleblower law, a law to protect government officials who step forward to report corruption or fraud. Well, too bad it took so long, because Canadian whistleblowers of the past have had a brutal ride. Tonight, the story of two courageous men, one who uncovered bribery, forgery, and profiteering at a Canadian embassy, and the other who tried to set it right. It's also the story of how the system tried to crush them both. It takes us to questions of political interference and control within the RCMP in this tale of corruption and cover-up. The story begins a dozen years ago in a place halfway around the world, Hong Kong, in the early 1990s. It was a time of uncertainty. 1997 was looming, the year that Communist China would take control of Hong Kong. And millions of Hong Kong Chinese were desperately looking for a way out. And Canada was far and away the country of choice. There were huge lineups at Canada's High Commission in Hong Kong to apply for visas, but there were some in the crowd who should have raised suspicion. Former Royal Hong Kong Police Inspector Sandy Boucher.
Organized crime figures, people with records, people without records, but serious criminals were looking to move to Canada. Some applied and got turned back, and some applied and got in.
And one of Boucher's cases proved exactly that. As the head of the Royal Hong Kong Police Narcotics Bureau, he was closing in on a notorious drug trafficker known as the Ice Queen. Li Chaoping's gang was producing almost 500 tons of the street drug crystal meth, also known as ice. When the police raided her labs and one of her safe houses, the Ice Queen got on a plane to Canada. You thought perhaps she was just going for a couple of weeks or a holiday? Or...
Oh, sure. I knew before the raid went down that it would probably spook her and her syndicate, and we assumed that she'd go over there, wait till things had died down a little, and she'd come back.
Boucher couldn't believe it when an RCMP officer called to say that the Ice Queen had landed.
And I said, well, of course she's landing. It's an airplane, you know. He said, no, she's landing. I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. And it turned out he meant she's going to be a landed immigrant. She was landing as an immigrant. And I said, it can't be. She's got a criminal record. I know that she's known to Canadian authorities. She was a major organized crime figure.
Plus, she's one of the biggest targets in Hong Kong and China at that time.
Yeah, that's who she was.
Li Chaoping was welcomed by the Canadian government as a business investor. Her story? She was willing to invest $170,000 in a fast food chicken franchise in, of all places, the wilds of northern Saskatchewan, a tiny town called L'Orange. Back in Hong Kong, some were beginning to wonder, if a high-profile criminal like the Ice Queen could get into Canada, how many other criminals were also being welcomed? It seemed that Chinese organized crime groups, known as the Triads, had found a way. Brian McAdam was the immigration control officer at Canada's High Commission in Hong Kong at the time. He was sending detailed intelligence back to Ottawa, warning that Canadian embassy staff were fraternizing with the wrong people. Who were they associating with that caused you concern?
People that I knew or had very good reason to believe were Triad members, Triad leaders.
Organized crime, Chinese organized crime.
Yeah.
And what were they doing with these people? Were they...
Well, they go to parties, they go to cocktail parties. I'd see them, people at the cocktail parties. Trips to Macau, shopping trips to Bangkok.
Expensive gifts, luxury yachts, trips to the casinos in Macau. But that wasn't all. Gary Clement is now the chief of police in the small town of Cobourg, Ontario. But in the early 1990s, he was an RCMP officer stationed at the High Commission in Hong Kong. Clement found more signs of corruption. Money handed out to Canadian embassy staff to bet on the horses at Hong Kong's luxurious Happy Valley racetrack. But that was only the first part of the deal. Clement remembers a warning that he received from a wealthy and connected businessman.
And the one thing that he told me very early on in my time there is nobody in the Chinese culture does anything for nothing. And I never forgot that. And I think that's where you have to look at why, you know, why was the Canadian mission being targeted? Why was the Canadian mission being invited out to all these events? Well, we all know, Canadian passports.
And it gets worse. At the time, all visa applications were being processed electronically. McAdam and Clement had come up with a special code to identify known criminals who had applied. Code H. Brian McAdam couldn't believe his eyes one day when, sitting at his computer, he opened his secret file of known Triad members to discover someone had broken into the system.
Suddenly, within just a few seconds of the name and the details appearing, the name just started dropping off like the letters were sliding off a ruler sort of thing. You know, they're just falling down, and the screen was blank. I thought I was doing something wrong, so I thought I'll just grab another file that doesn't have this code, see what happens. The other files came out, no problem. They didn't disappear. Just my files, which were coded H.
And these files were essential because this was the basis of the intelligence that you had collected on some very bad guys who wanted into Canada.
Right.
And with that information deleted from the computer, all of a sudden they would look clean.
Oh, indeed. Yeah.
And just be let through the system.
Yeah.
The evidence was mounting that something was going on. The RCMP launched an investigation, and the Department of Foreign Affairs sent over a computer expert. The top secret report, prepared by David Balser in 1992, confirmed the worst suspicions. There were alarming breaches of Canada's immigration policies. But for reasons unexplained, the RCMP investigation ignored the Balser report.
Anybody that saw that report should have taken very definitive action. Why it was not taken, I don't know.
The Mounties also paid little attention to evidence of bribery, forgery of visas, and profiteering at the Canadian High Commission. How compromised was Canada at that point?
It was extremely vulnerable. And the most disturbing thing is that no one took this problem seriously at the time.
No one except for Brian McAdam, who was pushing for a full inquiry into the allegations of corruption and fraud, allegations that pointed directly to the staff at the High Commission. But suddenly, the career civil servant who had received glowing performance reviews found himself shunned by his colleagues.
Nobody wanted to talk to me, and I became very ostracized within the office.
Well, no wonder they didn't want to talk to you. You were the guy
I was trouble.
turning over all the stones and rocks.
Trouble.
You were trouble. Despite all the efforts to shut McAdam down, the scandal would not go away. Too many people knew. The corruption at the High Commission in Hong Kong was known far and wide by certain criminal organizations, and that brings us here to London. We found a man who knows firsthand the operations of Chinese organized crime, otherwise known as the Triads. He agreed to come out of the shadows, to fly in from an undisclosed location and meet us here in London, to reveal for the first time what he knows about the connections between the Triads and the scandal at the Canadian High Commission. Some members of the international intelligence community have long supported Brian McAdam, and they persuaded this man to talk to W5. But he had conditions. We had to protect his identity. No name, no pictures of his face, and his voice had to be altered. He is connected to the Triads through family and business, and talking to us about them could be fatal. But he says he knows exactly how they operated with the Canadians.
First of all, some Triad member, they don't present as a Triad. They are very famous businessmen, even legislator, solicitor, accountant, and they hold senior position in the Triad. They will invite whoever newly arrived from Canada to work in the High Commission of Canada in Hong Kong to go to race course, in their box, do some racing, talking, and then going party, or going on a big yacht, and some money change, some handshake, and problem solve, you know. Can you afford to buy a gold Rolex? So they give a gold Rolex, fancy car. then when you get hooked on, then they will ask you to do a favor. Besides, who knows? At those days, who knows? Everybody doing, I think. I think it takes more than one person in the High Commission of Canada to get the job done, not just one single person. It must be a big, big scandal behind it all.
With the type of corruption that was evident at the High Commission at that time, is it possible that a number of very serious criminals, Triad members, would get through the system and get to Canada?
They're already living there now. Big time. Businessmen. Property in Chinatown. Business. If you try to tell me nobody take bribery in that time, nobody in Hong Kong will believe it. Especially those who couldn't make it.
How much? How much would it cost?
Nobody give me the price, but I will figure out somewhere about $500,000 Hong Kong dollar. Will you pay $500,000 to buy the whole family and insurance? Would you like to go to Africa or some tiny island in Pacific, or would you like to go to the Maple Leaf? I would choose the Maple Leaf.
How many criminals bought their way in? Well, the half-hearted RCMP investigation turned a blind eye to that, but this scandal was about to take a new twist.
When we return, why no one in Ottawa paid any attention to the red flags and serious accusations.
The inquiry didn't happen.
No, it certainly didn't.
When CTV's W5 continues. Still to come, serious allegations of wrongdoing in Hong Kong. Why wasn't there an investigation?
If there was nothing to hide, you would welcome the police investigation. So obviously there was something that was going on.
When CTV's W5 continues.
Allegations of passports for sale at Canada's High Commission in Hong Kong, staff accepting gifts and money, socializing with known criminals, all uncovered by Immigration Control Officer Brian McAdam. Now, you might have thought that all of this would have set off alarm bells here on Parliament Hill. The very thought that employees of the Government of Canada were involved in massive corruption that could have allowed dangerous criminals into the country. But surprisingly, nobody here, not one ministry, not one agency, seemed to be very interested in getting to the bottom of this, except for one Liberal MP who felt that this was perhaps the most serious scandal that he had encountered in his political life. David Kilgore met with Brian McAdam, and he was convinced that something was seriously wrong in Hong Kong. In this 1995 letter to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, he tried to warn him about the highly irresponsible and/or illegal activities and asked for a full public inquiry.
I thought that what McAdam was saying as a 30-year veteran of Immigration Canada who had done, I think, 2 postings in Hong Kong, that what he was saying was serious enough that I thought I should refer it first to the Immigration Minister of the day and then to the Prime Minister.
The inquiry didn't happen.
No, it certainly didn't.
Prime Minister Jean Chrétien never even acknowledged Kilgore's letter. And it was into that climate of see no evil, hear no evil that our second whistleblower stumbled. RCMP Corporal Robert Reed was assigned to review the Hong Kong file, and what he discovered would change his life forever.
It's kind of like walking through, walking through a forest and all of a sudden you find yourself in quicksand.
Corporal Reed grew up in Regina, Saskatchewan, the home of the RCMP. Like any dedicated cop, Reed thought that his job was to dig into the allegations and get to the truth. One of the first things he came across was the top-secret Balsa report, which laid bare the security breaches. Armed with that, he went to his boss.
He said, well, this is water under the bridge. Why go over this again? And I was very shocked by that. I said, this is not water under the bridge. This is evidence of a major fault.
The more he dug into the affair, the more resistance he felt. The Departments of Foreign Affairs and Immigration blocked their staff from speaking with Reed, something that Reed's RCMP boss agreed to.
I arrived at the opinion that in fact, the progress I was making was not pleasing to my superiors.
He was not the first investigator who felt resistance. In 1993, Staff Sergeant Jim Puckniak wanted to go to Hong Kong and conduct a proper investigation. But the RCMP liaison officer at the mission, Inspector Gary Lajamodiere, wrote a memo back to Ottawa advising against it, saying it would upset the High Commissioner, John Higginbotham. Lajamodiere said that if your investigators came to Hong Kong, it would be viewed as a witch hunt, and he said, I can guarantee you, Canadian High Commissioner will be screaming at the highest political levels. What did you make of that?
My instinct then, and still is that if there was nothing to hide, you would welcome a police investigation. So obviously there was something that was going on.
Did you feel at any point that there was political interference at the highest levels on this investigation?
It just seemed throughout this investigation and anything to do with the Hong Kong file that there was always something blocking it, some reason why we couldn't go.
Corporal Reed felt the same frustration. Did you feel that maybe you were getting a little bit too close to a very uncomfortable truth for the Canadian government?
Well, I felt that I had discovered a cover-up. At that time, I believed that it was Department of Immigration and the Department of Foreign Affairs who were involved in this.
Let's just be clear about this. You're saying that there was a cover-up conducted by the federal government?
Yes.
By a couple of departments in the federal government?
Yes, sir.
You're also saying that there was obstruction of justice by the RCMP?
Yes.
Those are pretty serious charges.
Yes, they are, yeah.
In 1999, Corporal Reed did the unthinkable for a police officer. He broke his oath of secrecy and went public about the scandal in Hong Kong. The RCMP reacted swiftly. The force charged the 24-year veteran with professional misconduct, found him guilty, and fired him. And that might have been the end of it. But Reed appealed his dismissal to the RCMP's Civilian Review Committee. And out of the thousands of pages of documents and testimony from his disciplinary hearing came this decision in September 2003. Vindication for Reed and McAdam and scathing criticism of the RCMP. The review committee found that the RCMP was walking on eggshells whenever it conducted an investigation into activities at the Canadian mission abroad. And this, what is at issue, was a deliberate choice made by the RCMP not to pursue an investigation into possible criminal wrongdoing, even though numerous examples had been drawn to its attention. It warned that the RCMP must not allow itself to be co-opted by government agencies. Retired RCMP Superintendent Gary Clement believes that the force failed in its duty to protect the citizens of Canada.
We dropped the ball. I mean, I don't think we should try and defend it. The bottom line is we dropped the ball in this investigation.
The review committee found that while Corporal Reed made mistakes, he was justified in raising a matter of legitimate public concern and recommended that the RCMP reinstate him. But the question of the cover-up remains active. Liberal MP David Kilgore.
Nobody's above the law. Ultimately, it was the RCMP's responsibility to say to anybody who was telling them, don't rock any boats or don't do this or don't do that, to say, sorry, our mandate is to go and see if there's been a criminal offense committed.
Do you think that we will ever get to the bottom of who was truly behind the cover-up in this case?
I don't know. I would think if we had a team of investigators assigned to go and find out, I don't think it'd be very hard to find out what happened, even now, 10 years later.
Former Hong Kong Police Inspector Sandy Boucher.
It should have been dealt with, and it wasn't. The way it's ended up, this story has ended up, is staggering.
Do you believe there was a Canadian cover-up on this?
Sure. If you look at, what's happened with the overall picture of the Hong Kong mission, I've no doubt there's a cover-up.
But by who and why? Well, there are a number of places to look. Exposing the corruption at the High Commission would have embarrassed the government. It could have ruined the careers of some bureaucrats, and it would have revealed a woefully inadequate RCMP investigation. As it turned out, no one was embarrassed and no one lost their jobs, except for the two whistleblowers, Robert Reed and Brian McAdam, who became the target of a vicious personal campaign.
I don't think in 30 years of being involved in policing I've ever seen a character assassination that took place by an organization. First, from somebody that really did his job. He was very well-meaning. He represented, I think, what the public expects of a civil servant.
McAdam eventually suffered a nervous breakdown and had to take early retirement. Do you ever regret having spoken out? Life would have been a whole lot easier if you didn't, you know.
No, personally, I do not regret it. My ethics are such that I had to do what I did. But it's not easy being a whistleblower.
The Mounties' creed, they always get their man. Well, in this case, the only man they got was one of their own, a lowly corporal. The findings of the review committee are not binding, and the RCMP has refused to reinstate Robert Reed. He now spends his days volunteering at an Ottawa community center, his policing career in ruins. And remember the Ice Queen? Well, just months after she emigrated to Canada, she disappeared. Today, 14 years later, still on Interpol's list of most wanted fugitives. Last known address, Canada. By the way, that legislation to protect whistleblowers in the federal civil service, well, it doesn't cover members of the RCMP. And Corporal Reed's battle with the Mounties continues. It's now in the federal court, which will hear the appeal of his dismissal next year. We'll be right back.